Adobe Illustrator has a lot of preferences that you can set, so I want to show you the most important ones. And a little different between Windows and Macintosh is how you get to preferences. In Windows, you can go up to the Edit menu, and Preferences will be down at the bottom. On the Mac, you go to the Illustrator menu, and Preferences are right here. Because Preferences is so important, they give you actually two keyboard shortcuts to get in there. One is Command K or Control K in Windows, and specifically for the Mac, just like in every OS X application, Command comma will get you into preferences. So whichever way you want to do it is fine. I'll start up here with General, and all of those items that you just saw in that flyout you see over here also on the left. So let's just kind of go through these. This keyboard increment, that means that when you have an object on the artboard and you want to push it up, down, left, or right in exact increments, you may know already that you can tap the cursor keys on the keyboard. Well, how far does an object move when you do that? Here's where you set that. Let's say you're drawing a rounded corner rectangle. You can set the default corner radius right here. Use precise cursors simply means that, let's say if you're using a brush, you can get a crosshair instead of the actual icon. I showed you earlier in the course how to get into isolation mode by double-clicking an object. This is simply enabling that feature. You probably want to leave on is scale, strokes, and effects. So if you have an object and you make it much bigger or much smaller, the stroke and effect will resize with the rest of the object. Here's the real big change in Creative Cloud, or addition, I should say, not change. Go over here to Sync Settings. When you use Illustrator and you're signed into Creative Cloud, you can sync your settings with any other machines that you have. So let's say you have Illustrator running on a computer at work, and you also have Illustrator running at home, and you change some settings on one machine, you want the other machine to update with those settings, you could do that right here. So as long as you're logged into Creative Cloud, you can choose Sync Settings now. If you click Manage Account, it'll simply bring you to Creative Cloud on the web where you will log in and manage some other items. I'm not going to do that here. Here you can choose what you do or don't want to sync. You can select or deselect anything that you want. Turn those both on. And you can also hit this drop down and maybe sync all settings, whether they're selected or not, or just selected settings. Maybe you don't want to sync anything, and I really don't understand the point for that. So let's say you've made some changes on one machine and you've made changes to the same item on the other machine and you go to sync. Well, what's going to happen? So here's conflict resolution of which wins. Will the computer you're on take precedence, or will the settings up in the cloud take precedence, or simply which is the latest one that you did? When we're done with this, I'll show you something. You may have noticed there is another place you can go and sync the settings without even having to come all the way in here to the Preferences dialog box. All right, let's go over here to Selection and Anchor Display. And over here we have the tolerance setting. You might want to increase that if you're having trouble selecting things. One of the things about Illustrator that's kind of frustrated me over the years is that those little anchor points are really small. And the older I get and the worse my eyesight gets, the harder it is, I find, to click those tiny little anchors. So if you increase the number here, it means right now if I get within 3 pixels of an anchor point, it'll be considered selected. So if you're having trouble, you could boost up that number. Also down here, I tend to select these options here for anchors and handles. Also makes them a little bit bigger visually. I showed you earlier in the course, if you have one object behind another object and you're having trouble selecting it, if you command click or in Windows control click, then you can select an object that's fully behind another object. Here, showing handles when multiple anchors are selected. You could do that here, or when you're actually editing the Bezier curves and anchor points, you can do that. We also discussed that earlier in the course. Let's go over here to Type. These numbers are simply the defaults for size, tracking, and baseline, and you can modify those at any time. Down over here, let's say if you have some fonts that are in other languages, some Asian languages, if they have English names, you can turn this on and do it. No guarantee that every font is going to have an English name. And the recent fonts that show up in the list, how many of those do you want? So you can increase that. Maybe if there's a dozen fonts that you use often, you can always do that. Now, why would you not want a font preview? I really have no idea. What I did was I made it bigger so the previews are easier to see. And let's go over here to units. And we talked about this also earlier in the course. I generally like to measure in inches. And let's say if you decide that you really like measuring in millimeters, well, feel free. Again, that's the default. You could change this at any time. Let's go over here to guides and grid. Now the guides, we looked at ruler guides earlier. If you decide that you don't want them cyan, you want them another color, you could do that. If you don't like any of the colors here, you could choose custom and pick a custom color. Now the custom color picker on the Mac looks slightly different from the custom color picker on Windows, but the same general idea. Pick any old color you want. Let me just close that. And the same for the grid. You can pick a custom color for the grid. And do you want the grid to be lines or dots? Also for the guides, do you want those to be lines or dots? And we talked about the rest of this earlier in the course, so I won't repeat it. Smart guides. Also, you can choose a custom color. You can choose where or when smart guides are going to come up. Slices we really didn't talk about in this course, so I'm not going to mention them here. That has to do with taking your artwork and slicing it up for turning it into a web page. Hyphenation, if there are certain words that Illustrator is hyphenating and you don't like the way they're hyphenating, you can always enter your own hyphenation examples in there. Plugins and scratch disks. This is something kind of important. Let's say you find that you're downloading or buying all kinds of plugins and you don't want to put these into Illustrator's default plugins folder. You can always specify a separate plugins folder, maybe one that's easier for you to get to. What scratch disks are is as Illustrator is working, it's always kind of juggling things around in memory. Not the actual artwork that you see on the page, it's just happening internally. If you find that you're running out of room on your hard drive, maybe you have a second hard drive, you might want to set the primary or secondary scratch disk to the other hard drive. And you can simply click here. Now, right now I have an external hard drive plugged in. It's called ADATA. That's just the name of it. So I could select that if I want. So I could do that for the primary, or I could do that for the secondary. Or maybe secondary, I just don't have one. I don't want to set anything for the secondary scratch disk. If you notice that Illustrator is starting to bog down, maybe it's running very slowly, especially if you're running a lot of effects, then you might want to try adding another scratch disk. Let's go over here to User Interface, and this is just kind of personal preference. How dark or how light do you want the screen to look? So medium dark is the default. You could set it as very dark, or medium light, or very light. Practically need sunglasses. And these are just settings for this little slider here. So if you really want it exactly over here, you can do that. I don't know. I'm just going to set this back to the default. I like the default, but feel free to play around with it. It's kind of entertaining for about 5 minutes. Now, when you're setting this, let me just move this down here a little bit. See, here's the artboard itself. Do you want the color of the artboard or the whiteness of the artboard to match the lightness or darkness of the interface itself, or do you want it to be always exactly white regardless of how light or dark the rest of Illustrator is? So I'll leave that up to you. And file handling and clipboard, leave these alone. The default settings make Illustrator work the best way possible. And finally, the last thing here, appearance of black. We already covered this in Chapter 4, so this is really a reminder of where to find this option. And to review what we talked about back in Chapter 4, there's kind of 2 ways of displaying black. You can have kind of the standard ink, which is kind of like a light black, or you can have what's called rich black, where this is really when you're doing printing. It has nothing to do with RGB colors. When you're printing, you could add in extra amounts of cyan, magenta, and yellow to make black look really nice and dark. Now, once you've made all the settings you want, you can click OK. And I mentioned before that syncing settings, there's another place you could do it without having to go all the way back in there. And that is when you go up here, back into the Illustrator menu, or in Windows, you can go into the File menu. You can simply roll over your login name, and when you do that, you can sync settings now. And these other options are just what you saw in the Preferences dialog box, but this way you don't have to go all the way into the Preferences dialog box to do it. Now you can really customize Illustrator to behave exactly the way you want. So isn't Illustrator Creative Cloud wicked cool and lots of fun? It's one of my favorite programs, and I learn new techniques all the time. I hope you had as much fun in this course as I did. And learning is never done. I invite you to read my blog at flisser.com, And follow me on Twitter and on Google+, where I use my real name. And if you have any tips for me, send them along. For Total Training, I'm Bob Flisser, and thanks so much for watching.